Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar in partnership with EUCOPE called The Future of Rare Disease Innovation in Europe. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and I'd like to thank you for your participation today. If you're having connection problems, as we all know, in the world of Zoom, we're all on the internet and sometimes the bandwidth isn't what we'd like. We have provided several dozen phone numbers for you. Just click next to the mute button. This menu will pop up and there are several dozen phone numbers that you can choose from for free, toll-free internationally. We really want you to hear everything, so please feel free to use the phone if you have to. As well, we will be taking questions from the audience. We've had 300 registrations today. Again, thank you for your participation. We do want your questions. We understand this is an important topic today. We absolutely want your input, so please, we will be taking questions. Submit your questions in the question bar, and we will endeavor to answer them as we go through this webinar. So building on the Office of Health Economics Analysis that was released at the 10th European Conference on Rare Diseases, EUCOPE is organizing this webinar to discuss the future of rare disease innovation and access to orphan and medicinal products in Europe. We will discuss trends impacting the rare disease community in preparation of the EU's OMP and pediatric regulation evaluation. It's been 20 years since the launch of the OMP regulation, and what can we learn to improve from our experiences? I'm joined today by a multi-stakeholder panel, including policymakers, patients, investors, and small to mid-sized OMP industry representatives. All of their contributions, as well as yours and your questions, are crucial to have an educated conversation on this topic. And I'm grateful to have as our participation. First, I'd like to introduce Olga Solomon, the Head of Unit of Medicinal Products at DG Santé from the European Commission. Good morning, Olga. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very happy to be with you today. Thank you, Don.
It's a pleasure, Olga. And also we have Anna Buzis, former HTA from Austria, now the policy advisor to the Mechanism of Coordinated Access to Orphan and Medicinal Products, MOCA, a mouthful. Hello, Anna. Thank you for your participation. And you're muted, but...
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to participate.
Thank you, Anna. And Jack Scannell from JW Scannell Analytics, the former co-head of pharmaceuticals at UBS and arguably one of the world's great analysts on the biotech and pharmaceutical field. Jack, always a pleasure. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thomas Bowles, the Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy at PTC Therapeutics. Hello, Thomas.
Hi there, Dwayne. Hi, everybody.
Thank you. And of course, Demetrius Athanasiou from the World Duchenne Organization, a patient group. Hello, Demetrius. Good morning.
Hello, everybody. Great topic. Nice to be with you.
So first, I'd like to also introduce Alexander Nantz, the Secretary General of EUCOPE. And Alexander, you're going to give us a few introductory statements. So please, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Thanks very much for setting this up for us. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I must say that this panel is very important for us. We're really delighted to host this panel. It's at a very important time. We, as EUCOPE, we represent more than 130 pharma and biotech companies, which are almost all of them are mid-sized companies, and they're active in the field of rare diseases. So it's really a very important topic for us. And we've seen over the last couple of years an increased discussion, both at the member state level, but also at the EU level, about rare diseases, but also about orphan drugs. And this is probably due to the fact that we have seen more and more orphan drugs coming to the market over the last 10 years. And you could say that that the regulation did what it was supposed to do, which is generating therapy options for patients with a rare disease. And that's very important, and we will come back to that point in the course of this important discussion. But on the other hand, there are many new therapies being orphan drugs as well, many of them being gene therapies. Those products are coming to the market and they have a different price level. So there is clearly an important need for this discussion. So you could ask the question, why this discussion now? I mean, it's probably the best point in time to have this discussion and debate for the simple reason that we will see a publication of an orphan drug and pediatric of the orphan drug and pediatric regulation approaching. There's a consultation process ongoing. We have seen the pharmaceutical strategy released by the European Commission. So it's the right point in time. And I'm really delighted to have this distinct panel with us today. And last but not least, we've seen, and I think that will also be touched upon, we've seen changes in how patients with a rare disease get treatment options over the crisis, over the COVID-19 crisis. We will also touch on that point. I think that will also be built into the pharmaceutical strategy. So there's a lot to cover, and I think I must say, I would like to thank you, Dwayne, very much for setting up this distinct panel, and I guess we will have a very good discussion and many discussions and debates during this 1 hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. And to begin, of course, we have a great audience, and we'd like to launch a poll for you. And just quickly, given all the controversy that's been occurring around COVID-19 and the fact that we've had some production and access issues regarding the disease, and it's cut off the ability of people to produce some feedstocks, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being completely agree, how strongly do you agree with the following statement? Given the experience of COVID-19, it is vital that Europe supports homegrown companies developing OMPs from EU original research. So we'd very much appreciate your opinion. Do you agree with that statement or not? And while we're collecting those results, I will move forward with a couple points of discussion. First, we've been looking at the EU OMP market over the last few years. This is the history of OMPs across Europe. And you see that in general, it's been very successful, but we also see quite a marked decline over the last 4 years that goes against trend. From 2016 to 2019, we see quite a large drop in both designations and market access of OMP products approved. Now, I was asked to compare this to the US market. Now, again, I understand this is always fraught with peril. The US and Europe are very different markets, and they act differently, and the qualifications for being an OMP are different. However, that being said, we do see that there's a marked trend in Europe, quite a strong decline, whereas in the US, we see that designations themselves are quite flat, and there's actually still been an increase in products coming to market. So we see somewhat of a divergence between the EU and the US over these last 4 years. Now this slide here comes from the Office of Health Economics. This is a report that was commissioned by EUCOPE, and it shows the EBITDA. This is the amortization and earnings before tax and depreciation. And what you see here is in 7 companies that produce, small to mid-sized companies, I should say, that produce orphan drugs, you see that there's a lack of profitability. And matter of fact, most companies are losing money. So just to set the context here, I'd like to ask the panel our first question. In general, it's recognized that the OMP regulation has been a success, supporting the development of OMPs long-term. However, since 2016, Europe has seen a drop in the designation and development of OMPs. Further, the EU-based small to mid-sized companies focused on developing OMPs are not profitable. What can and should we do with regards to this situation? And first, I'm going to come to you, Olga. From your perspective, what do you think we should do from the European Commission standpoint? You're working on an incentives review and the pharmaceutical policy. What do you think we should do?
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, it's interesting points actually, and it is where we dwell in our evaluation to see exactly this type of findings, to see how the regulation has worked since it has been in place from 2000 and until 2017. I mean, what you are actually presenting here, it is, one part of the many aspects that, we have been looking into the evaluation that, we have performed. And it is interesting to see this figure, which some of them actually, they fall out the period that we have evaluated. So it is even more interesting for us. And I would say that to a certain extent, this concur with some of the findings that, we have seen in the evaluation. But at the same time, I have to say that there are many factors that influence, this landscape. That's what we find from our studies. The factors are multiple, and, a thorough analysis is needed before we can draw very actually, firm and sound conclusions about, such numbers. And I will explain, what I mean. So, it is true, what Alexander said, that, what we have seen, it is that since the regulation was in place in 2000, there has been an increase in orphan designations and authorized orphan medicine. So that was a good result, in general. With regard to the comparison that you are doing between the EU and the US, what, we have seen, it is that indeed we have a higher annual number of designations and marketing authorizations for orphan medicines in the US than in the EU. Even for the period outside the ones that you saw there, and this it is explained to a certain extent, but also differences in eligibility criteria that we have in orphan to obtain the orphan designations in the EU and in the US. So also the percentage, this translates also in the percentage of the designated orphans that they turn into authorized products, which are also less in the EU. But, as I said, we need to be mindful that, of these differences in the system. So in the EU, for example, the number of people affected, by a disease, in order for this to be defined as a rare disease, is lower than the US. Also, in addition, very important it is that the US, they can assign, an orphan designation to a subset of a wide condition, which not necessarily rare, and this is a distinct difference from the EU. And also in the EU, we have a two-step procedure for orphan medicines, where basically the status has to be, actually confirmed in two cases, at the time of the designation and at the time of the approval. So that means that, there are some designations which are eligible for, in the US, but not in the EU. So some differences are explained, there. Another very important element that we found from our study, especially with respect to your slide number 7, where we see this peak of designation in the EU in 2014, 2015, and 16. According to our study, this relates to the research policy, in the EU. So basically, the framework programs, they relate, there has been a requirement for funding on orphan designations since 2009. But with the Horizon 2020 program, it was also a condition for products to get funding. So we saw, an extremely increase, of the request for products designation exactly in the period that, you are projecting now. And that was related to funding reasons from research. So it was a 50% increase on orphan designations during the period 2009-2015 in comparison to the period 2000-2008. So this explains also, this big one of the factors. I don't say it is the only one. Also, in relation to the decline, what you said, the decline of the designations in the EU, another interesting finding of our evaluation, it is that since the beginning of the regulation, the years following the establishment of the regulation, we have seen a decline in the areas, therapeutic areas, where we see the designation. So just to give you some numbers, while in the beginning of the regulation, in the years 2000, after 2000, we saw, for example, 78% of orphan designations being in areas where we had no therapeutic options, which was normal. The regulation was new. Today, we see only 1 out of 5, so only 20%, of these designations are for new therapeutic areas. So basically what we see is a consolidation of actually, the designation, the request for designations for areas, where therapeutic options already exist. What does this mean? It is that, the new products, they have to actually, demonstrate a significant benefit compared to those products that are on the market. That has as an effect that, and actually, just to give you, again, some numbers, between 2000 and 2015, 64% of all the designations, they needed to demonstrate significant benefit. That means that, some of these designations are not approved. So we lose some of them in the process because we have this consolidation in the same therapeutic areas. And also, just, in relation to that, a bit on a different, conclusion, this trend also indicated for us another inefficiency rather in the system, that, while this regulation was there to promote, the development of medicines in areas where we didn't have therapeutic options. With this consolidation, we see now that, there is a clustering around areas where there are already therapeutic areas because there is knowledge, and there is, also sometimes more profitable areas. So we are actually, assessing all this. Is that just to say that, it is difficult to speak about a decline a real decline on the, there is a decline, obviously, from the figures, but, that where it is attributed and where this will be stabilized, we don't know yet. And the positive thing it is that, we still see an increase in authorized products, in the EU. So in 2020, for example, already we have 10 orphan medicines authorized, and we hope really that, this will continue, this trend will continue. Just on the last point, not to take more time, about the profitability, of the EU, as for rare diseases policy, and for orphan medicines, the SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies, they are in the heart actually of any policy that we're taking. They are already into the regulation. There are certain like fee waivers, incentives for SMEs, and actually they represent the heart of these developments. We see about 50% protocol assistance and designation asked by SMEs, and this is something which is extremely important. However, I'm not so sure that I can concur, according to our findings, to the conclusion that they are non-profitable, or that they are losing. This is not something. I mean, we tried to see what it is the return of investment with regard to the cost of research, which basically we don't know very much, and we didn't come to the conclusion that they are losing money, these companies. I mean, this was not the conclusion that we had. Anyway, just to say that this is extremely interesting. I mean, and all this discussion we're having today, it informs our policy about the options on the orphan regulation, and this relates very much to our actually wider policy, on pharma strategy. As Alexander said, we have published the public consultation, and the focus of this pharma strategy, of which the orphan regulation is part, it is to strive for innovation, create the right environment for innovation in the EU, but at the same time address an acute problem of access to medicines, and shortages and unmet medical needs, because, it is, again, as you all know, the cost of these medicines and the access, basically, in the end of patient, it is something that it is a concern, especially, for the member states and the health systems. So with all these initiatives in the Commission, we try to see the trade-offs, and we need to actually have a holistic view of how to address these issues, so that we continue to have a competitive interest position in the global level, and to create clear pathways for these products to the market and to the patients. Thank you, Duan.
Thank you, Olga. I'd like to share the results of the survey, just so everyone can see. So generally, we have a general agreement that we need to be keeping products here in Europe, and not letting them, we need to be developing the products that are invented here. Olga, obviously we have Thomas Bowles, who works for a small, medium-sized company, but first I would like to go to Jack. Jack, can you describe the investment dynamics between Europe and the US, and what we're seeing from asset pull between the US and Europe right now?
Okay, so I'll qualify my comments in a couple of ways, just with observation to some of the data we've seen.
Sure.
Right. So, and also I'll say something which may be depressing for Europeans, but which is true. So I'll start off with a thing which may be depressing for Europeans, but true. And this is a quote from a former colleague of mine or from a competitor of mine actually, called Simon Baker, who once told me when I started looking at drug and biotech investment, he said, only half joking, that pharmaceutical and biotechnology R&D is a little bit like NATO between 1948 and 1989, of great benefit for Europeans, but largely paid for by Americans, right? So from a European perspective, drug pricing in America in many respects looks mad, right? We can't believe how much they pay for drugs, many of which have so little effect. But that pricing environment is hugely powerful in incentivizing private sector R&D investment, right? So private sector R&D investment chases the money. Drugs aren't expensive because companies spend a lot on R&D. Companies spend a lot on R&D because drugs are expensive, right? Now, recently, particularly in the US, but globally, orphan drugs have been seen as a large, lucrative, price-insensitive market. And there's been a huge shift over the last 15 years in the pipelines of the global drug industry towards orphan diseases and oncology, and those things overlap to a certain extent, but there's been a massive pipeline shift because the pricing has been very benign, and arguably the regulatory hurdles are a little bit lower. So when I was working for UBS, until about a year ago, we were scratching our heads thinking, oh my God, there's so much capital flowing into orphan drugs that we don't think the companies are going to make money, right? There's just too many people chasing these indications. And that, to me, makes the difference between the US and European orphan drug approval trends actually very interesting, right? Because it's not like people aren't interested in developing drugs for orphan diseases. Private sector companies are very, very interested in doing that. They're deploying lots of capital because they think they will make decent returns. But it does appear that people are getting a little bit less enthusiastic about doing it, about going through the European approval pathway. Now, I think it's quite important to understand where that disparity comes from. I don't think I understand it very well. I've done a little bit of rummaging. Some of it is quite complicated. So clearly, for example, in some cases, the same drug is available in the US and Europe, but for some reason it gets an orphan designation in the US, but not Europe. So there's a lot of cancer drugs like that. That explains some of the difference. Some of it is kind of label extension, which happens in the US, but not in Europe. It doesn't seem to me that a huge amount of it is to do with drugs that treat sort of, for example, rare childhood diseases being available in the US and not in Europe, right? But I think it's important to understand what's driving that difference. But the difference strikes me as plausible, and it bears, or rather the recent difference strikes me as plausible, given what I think is concern in the drug industry about increasing price dispersion between the US and Europe. So Trump, a populist, had common cause with Democrats around drug prices. Some of his proposals effectively said we're going to effectively benchmark US prices against ex-US prices. This made drug companies much more concerned about price disparity between the US and outside of the US. And again, as another former investment competitor told me a few years ago, drug companies are getting increasingly concerned about the price differential between the US and the rest of the world. That doesn't necessarily mean US prices go down, right? And although I think it's not necessarily clear from the data, I think one concern I have is that as US, ex-US price dispersion gets more and more important for US politicians, drug companies may become more cautious about launching drugs into Europe if they fear that they would have to have a low and transparent price that US politicians could then kick them about.
Thanks, Jack. Thomas, now you work for a small, medium-sized enterprise that focuses on, shall we say, OMPs, orphan drugs. Are you hugely profitable? I mean, is this a license to print money in Europe, Thomas? Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, I guess indeed. I'm working for a company that is a typical member of EUCOPE, as Alexander introduced. And actually, we're not an SME, as according to the Commission's definition, which I think only goes up to 250 employees, which is actually another discussion that we should probably have, because then after 250, there's a huge gap and this disparity between the sizes of the company. So we're indeed a sort of mid-sized company. Global company, around 800, 900 people worldwide. So it is indeed not huge. And indeed focusing exclusively on the development of therapies for rare diseases. And so I just wanted to come back to some of the things that I heard Jack saying, but also what Olga saying. And so to a certain extent, I agree with a lot that was said. On the other hand, I don't recognize at least PTC in some of the comments, right? So first of all, I think, and on some of the comments from you, Dwayne, about sort of decline and so on. So I think we're very optimistic about the future. And I don't want to give a whole presentation about our pipeline, but we are very optimistic about our pipeline. We have a really interesting pipeline, as I said, focusing on rare diseases. Some of those rare diseases have a therapy, SMA, but also to Olga's point, actually some of the therapies that we have in development will be the first therapy that will be then hopefully available for patients for diseases like AADC, Friedreich ataxia, we have at the moment the only therapy available for Duchenne. So actually, I don't recognize that we as a company try to focus on therapy areas where there are already therapies available, right? So it's a more complex picture than that. The other thing is, I also don't recognize some of the things that Jack says about companies being reluctant to launch in Europe because of the price disparities, etc. Because, again, I realize maybe we're a bit unusual in the biopharma world. Our most important therapy that I mentioned before for Duchenne muscular atrophy is actually not available in the US. Right? It is available for patients because we make it actually as a company policy available for patients that are in clinical trials, but it's not approved in the US. It's actually approved only in well, we're talking about Europe. It's approved in certain European countries, not all, which is another challenge that we have, because this is a therapy that has been approved in Europe in 2014, 2015, and it's still not available for all patients that really should have it. Another example is we will, very excitingly, we will launch get our approval for our first gene therapy for AADC. And again, actually Europe is first. If everything goes according to the timelines, we will get an approval first in Europe and then in the US. So it is a bit more complicated than maybe some of the things that I've heard. Overall, as I said, we're focusing very much on developing therapies where there's an unmet medical need. And in that sense, when some of the other questions that came through, what should Europe do, is that, yeah, we are, of course, looking very carefully about the European environment. And it is very much around components like what's the R&D environment in Europe, what are the incentives, what are the market conditions, etc. So going forward, those are the elements that I think we look very much forward to institutions like the Commission to really promote, of course, together with the member states, to make sure that that we can develop those therapies and that we can make them available to patients. Because again, we have as an example a therapy that is very important that is not available to all patients in Europe, and it has nothing to do with price, because everything, we focus very much on the high cost of these kind of drugs and so on. But if you look at where it is available, there is no direct correlation between being available, let's say, in richer EU member states and less available in, let's say, more poorer member states. There's no direct correlation there. It has more to do with what are the evidence generations, the pricing and reimbursement systems, etc., where a lot of things can be improved to make access more available. So I think, just as a start already, because I think it came up with your first question, of course, is like what the EU can do. We as a company look very much forward to working with the Commission and member states and others to really get the right policies in place to make sure that the orphan drug rare disease space gets further developed and that therapies become available for patients.
Thank you, Thomas. A lot there to chew on. We could go for a few more questions, but I would like to press on. We're looking at the OMP, and this is some of the things that have come out around the long-term value of OMPs. If we look at the 2012 total estimated economic burden for a patient with Duchenne, it exceeds €250,000 in Germany. 34% of children with cystic fibrosis report clinical depression, of parents of children with cystic fibrosis and say that they have clinical depression. And OMPs contribute to quality of life. As we know, it can produce productivity. If we look at OMPs broadly, caregivers are often patients, particularly in something like Duchenne, that's an adolescent condition. Parents are forced to leave the workforce. This essentially costs society twice. In the case of CAR Ts for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, we see that hospital costs are up by 2/3 compared to bone marrow transplants, yet these are often not evaluated or quantified in the HTA process. How can we do a better job accounting for these impacts long term? Now, Anna, you're a former HTA. I'd like to go to you first. If we're looking at some of these, I mean, a lot of this isn't captured in the QALY, and you're muted. If you could unmute yourself, that'd be great. A lot of this isn't captured in the QALY. How do we do a better job capturing long-term value?
Well, I think this is actually where Europe can do a lot. and also help SMEs by supporting the gathering of real-world evidence on the one hand, and the natural history of the disease. I think if Europe supports this kind of research, and I believe it does, but maybe it should do more, that would help SMEs and also help in the future assessment of these products. And there has been a lot of talk about post-authorization evidence generation. So I think this is where companies and HTA and patients and payers should really come together and sort of agree on a post-launch evidence generation plan. And I hope that Europe can facilitate this. So I think this is where the help should come in. When the orphan drugs first came on the market, everybody said, okay, well, they're not cost effective, so let's move the goalpost. And the goalpost has indeed been moved quite far, but still, most orphan drugs would fail conventional benchmarks for cost effectiveness. So I think it would be very important to make sure that we have the IT and the scientific infrastructure to try to prove the company's claims of their benefit. And of course, with orphan drugs, you can't always do that before marketing authorization, but we should have a robust system for checking the claims afterwards. And that, I think, includes not only HTA and IT and all this and the methodology, but also the legal framework for data exchange in Europe, and also maybe some guidelines on how to make really good contracts with companies, so that the claims can really be verified and make sure that you can get consequences from those claims.
Thank you, Anna. Now, Demetrios, from your perspective as a patient advocate, and as well as having a Duchenne patient yourself, do you think we're doing enough on the HTA side to look at the long-term implications for a lot of these costs?
When it comes to this cost, I would like to follow Anna's thoughts, and I would like to break it in two parts on the equation. So the one cost, it has to do with the cost of the burden of the disease. So the HTA processes we have so far are not designed for rare diseases. Even the OMP-LHA regulation, it was designed basically almost 30 years ago, started working 20 years ago, and we try to solve the problems we have now with tools that were created in a broad age. So we definitely need new processes, new methodologies for this. When it comes to reimbursement models like managed entry agreements, etc., we all know the difficulties that we face across Europe, even to the more sophisticated countries. So they are coming, but they are coming too late and too little and too weak, if I can say. I don't think the system is really ready to manage gene therapies on high cost, but which also represents, let's say, a very high burden to the society from the patient side and the budget-wise side. The data is an issue. I think Anna agrees on this. We need to make sure that we break the silos that we have in data. Without data, we cannot do any assessment. I would either go collecting data and sharing data and having open data before the clinical, because this is where you're supposed to start, at least in the RTs. Patient-reported outcomes, real-world evidence supported by patients and their communities is a must. I really don't see any other way of doing it. Digital outcomes also, which is critical and even very much appreciated during the COVID. And definitely we need a more, let's say, structured evidence generation studies. We need to feed the system constantly with real-world data and patient-reported outcomes to provide enough data, let's say, to the HTA, to the reimbursement agencies to pay and to assess.
Can I jump in on that, on something, Demetrios? Do you think a lot of what you're saying would have been covered by the joint HTA process that was under discussion? Do you think that that should be revisited from a patient perspective?
I think from a perspective, there is no doubt about this. Because even the negotiative power of each country, I mean, we all know that, for example, every business goes to the first market that can take the highest returns, and that's okay. Businesses are not philanthropic, let's say, organizations like patients. So what we need from our side is to create an environment that it will cover the needs of the patient community in Europe. So we need obviously joint HTAs and joint reimbursement, because definitely it's completely different if you have a segmented market and you have to do the cycle 28 times than you have, let's say, a more structured environment. I don't know if this answers your question.
No, it is. And Anna, I mean, you're a former HTA. What's your opinion of the joint HTA process? Do you think that that's something that we should revisit since it's sort of gone awry?
Well, absolutely. I think that a joint European HTA would make sense for orphan drugs. And personally, this is just my personal opinion, not any of the institutions that I've worked with. I think maybe it should have been started just for orphan drugs and not, as a whole big monolithic. Right. Because orphan drugs are very often cutting edge, and not only in the technology like gene therapy, but also with other issues like patient participation and real world evidence of patient reported outcomes. So this would have been quite fitting, and I hope that this will somehow continue.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Anna. Thank you. Olga, is this part of the discussion right now? Is this bringing the HTA back, maybe looking at orphans? Is this something that could be brought back? Is this within the realm of possibility, or is this off topic right now?
No, it's not off topic. I mean, actually, the HTA, the proposal of the Commission is there, with its objectives. But I would say that, in general, I concur with a lot of the points were made by Anna and Dimitrios. And the whole pharma strategy, is looking on how to look in a holistic way on how to address these issues, keep innovation and at the same time have it on the market and have it, reaching the patients. I mean, we indeed, we see quite some disparities on availability, and I'm not so sure if I can agree, with that. It does not, I think we have studies that they show that, it is related to GDP, but not only, it's a very complex process. So I would, as part of the pharma strategy, we will be looking into ways and across policies of how to have more coherence between, these activities, and basically, the alignment of evidence, the use of digital tools, methods as well. In the past, the Commission was trying with different tools under the EU Health Programme, like with the OECD, to help member states exchange best practices and outcome-based payment schemes, so beyond even, HTA. So we will continue in all these directions, and these are, main pillars, I would say, of the pharma strategy. And the alignment, of the evidence, across, from regulators, HTA body payers, with respect, of course, to competencies, because, there are some issues where member states, they have their own saying about some decisions, but, certainly this is in the heart of the pharmaceutical strategy. Yes, Duan.
Thank you. Thomas, did you want to jump in? I thought you raised your hand.
No, I didn't raise my hand, but I'm happy to jump in. No, I concur. No, I concur a lot with what was said, right? But the HTA process, there is a lot to improve. What, as I said, it was developed not with orphan medicines in mind, so the whole process and the methodology doesn't fit orphan drugs. I think as a medium-sized company, the other thing that maybe was not mentioned as well is that it's very difficult to deal with 27 or more HTA institutions that all have their individual methodology and requirements in terms of data and so on. There's no harmonization there. If you compare it to the marketing authorization procedure, where you get one marketing authorization at the European level, and then this applies to all the member states, that's a huge difference with the HTA process. Where you have to negotiate and deal with, as I said, requirements all over the place, which is very cumbersome and often sometimes contradictory. And the other one is, I think what you had before and so on, is that the HTA process does not take into account some of the other either benefits of costs, for example, around caregivers, etc. Because the HTA bodies that you deal with just look at the cost of a medicine or a therapy and don't often, some countries are are better, like countries like Sweden, but often don't take this kind of holistic approach, which we think is very important to get to the true value of a therapy.
Demetrius, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I would like to also bring a little the discussion on the other side of the cost. So I understand the cost of medications, and I understand the assessment of the HTA and the value, but I think also we should view the other side of the cost, which is the burden to the system. And if this makes any economical sense, let's say, to invest. And I can give you an example for Duchenne that I know, and it is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, not atrophy. In published studies, we have found that in 2012, only in 4 countries, so Germany, US, UK, and Italy, the cost to the system was 2 billion. And maybe with a little inflated, let's say, numbers, the cost to develop a drug, including the failures and including everything else, is 2.6 billion. So I think that it makes sense, financial and societal, let's say, to invest and to assess best these drugs, let's say, for rare diseases, because it will answer not only the needs and the unmet need of the patients, but also it will help the sustainability of our health system. Thank you, Dwayne.
Thanks, Demetrius. Jack, I'd like to come to you. I mean, one of the things we see in Europe, one of the problems is, you're getting approved at EMA often with, EMA has often been more innovative than the US, the FDA. They're willing to take one-arm trials and things like that. But then it comes to the HTA process and it's a screeching halt. We're seeing over 500 days for oncology products in France, for example, for approvals. From an investor standpoint, how helpful would it be to have a better process that basically expedites the approval process and gets cash in faster?
So again, I may give you an answer which is depressing for Europeans, but it's the honest answer. So I worked in drug and biotech investment for 15 out of the last 20 years roughly, and I spent a huge amount of time doing detailed financial models of US markets because they're terribly important. In that 15 years, I never once did a detailed patient-based model of a European market. UK is less than 2% of global pharmaceutical demand. It's also the case that the adoption of new medicines is quicker in the US. So if one is making a decision to invest in an R&D program, right, individual European countries are rounding errors, and people will just make a conservative assumption that it takes quite a long time to get it onto the market in many European countries, right? And I think So Europe has already, so again, I was recently talking to a large global pharmaceutical investor who said China is more important to me than Europe, right? So at the margin, it might encourage a few more R&D projects to get funded if things got through in Europe a bit quicker. But I think it's already the case that people are making global pharmaceutical R&D investment decisions on the assumption that Europe is going to be relatively small and relatively slow, right? And so if you can make the numbers stack up for the US and China, then, fine, we'll get what we can in Europe. So I apologies if that's not, more sort of optimistic, but that I think is the way things are now. And furthermore, I think the expectation is that the European pharmaceutical market is going to grow more slowly than the global pharmaceutical market for the next 5-10 years. So in a sense, that's only going to, it's not getting more important, it's getting relatively less important.
So anything that Europe can do to try and increase its competitiveness is going to be really important, then, one would assume.
But again, I think you need to think of two separate things. I think if one is, so most R&D decisions, investment decisions, like putting something to clinical trials, they're going to be made on the basis of your global expectations, right? That's of which Europe is not going to be an enormous part because of its size and relative drug pricing. There's a separate thing which is around industrial policy, right? So if you want a thriving sort of biotech sector in Europe, well, that's different, right? So I think one should logically think, or rather it's possible to separate logically, at least to quite a large extent, sort of industrial policy type considerations, i.e. what should Europe be doing to stimulate the creation of sort of economic value here in biopharmaceutical companies versus the signals that Europeans sends to the global pharmaceutical market in terms of the sorts of drugs that are going to be developed. I think those are two different things.
Sure. Thanks, Jack. I'd like to go to some audience questions now. Obviously, we could go on talking amongst ourselves, as we often do, but I'd like to bring in the audience now. So we have an interesting question here from Mark Dooms. Could greater cooperation between the EMA and FDA help? Why starts from scratch? Should we have more cooperation? Thomas, I'll go to you. You work at PTC, a medium-sized biotech firm, bringing a lot of orphan products. Would you see greater cooperation be a boon?
Yeah, I think so, right? For sure. If you talk about sort of approval of new medicine, I think any cooperation between FDA and EMA would, of course, help if the requirements would be more going in one direction. I think that would streamline processes, etc. And I think, but Olga is probably better to comment on that. A lot has already been done in that area, and I'm sure that we haven't seen the end of it yet. But I think it would definitely be helpful for drug development of different companies. Yes.
Olga, any comment there? Or?
Yes, I mean, I would agree, with Thomas. I think that in terms of cooperation, there is more and more cooperation between EMA and FDA, and also on international level, a lot of discussions about, alignment of standards. So, I mean, can we do better? Probably yes, but there is already, a very good basis for cooperation. Now, again, this cannot say that it will be, one assessment. The two bodies need, to assess, according to their, to their procedures, and there will be some difficulties. They were mentioned sometimes where we have a medicine authorized, FDA not, and the other way around. But in general, there is a lot of effort for, cooperation.
Sure. Demetrius, yes.
Thank you. I have to wear my PTCO member hat. I have to say that I agree with Olga, there is a lot of effort. But coming from Dusan, I can tell you that we have one product approved in US that is not approved in Europe, and one product in Europe that is not approved in US. This is something that it's very, very hard to explain to your advocacy group, especially if you are a global organization. So that's the one part. I do not see a lot of cooperation in the level of approvals, but what we need to see is harmonization of assessment. And there is an effort. So also in the joint scientific advices, together with FDA and EMA, I think this is a golden opportunity. It doesn't always return the results we want, but it is a way that it can work. And definitely we can do a lot and better work on this. And maybe when we're discussing about approvals, I think it's, at least from our experience, easy to understand that in FDA, we have approvals with biomarkers, and in EMA, you have approvals by clinical outcomes. This will never close this gap, so we have to find a way somewhere.
Anna, any comments on more cooperation between EMA and FDA?
Well, my impression is that there is a lot of cooperation going on with regard to scientific advice and methodology. And the Duchenne situation is, I completely understand how frustrating it is, but I think that's an exception and not the rule. And I really do appreciate Jack's points about differentiating between industrial policy and access and marketing products by small companies in Europe. I think it's a fallacy to believe that HTA really influences industrial policy that much. There's so many other things going on, but a Europe-wide HTA would really help, companies where the product is already approved in the US, probably because that's usually the case, also put the product on the market in Europe and make it accessible.
Thank you, Anna. We have a question here from Andrew Law. This is for Alexander and Thomas. The collection of real-world evidence relies on an established diagnostic criteria for orphan drug populations, which is not always easy, nor the case. Data mining depends on sufficient registries to be available to mine. Small companies having to collect this data from scratch as a condition of authorization may find this financially burdensome, yes, but is the right thing to do? Can EMA help, or is a regulation going to help? Thomas, data collection and approval, that's obviously burdensome. What's your opinion of that? And then Alexander, I'll come to you too. And Anna, I'll come to you too, Anna.
On the concrete question, can EMA help with real-world evidence? I would say yes, right? Because indeed, one of the challenges, of course, that we have with orphan medicines is that the standard approach with clinical trials is going to be challenging, if not impossible in a lot of cases, purely because the numbers are not there for clinical trials to come up with meaningful data in clinical trial setting, right? The numbers of patients are so small that it doesn't work. So you definitely have to rely on what is called then real world evidence and registries, etc. And what we see indeed is that there are lots of challenges there. There's no real framework around that. There's no real consensus around criteria how to generate that. You have with registries all kind of challenges between private company registries, disease registries, etc. So anything that can be done there to harmonize that field, to make it more predictable, what is required both from a regulatory side and from an HTA payer side in terms of admissibility, quality, etc. of real world evidence, I think that would be very helpful, particularly in this field indeed of orphan medicines.
Alexander.
Yes, indeed. I mean, real-world evidence, we heard it a couple of times coming up from the audience, is a critical vehicle to close data gaps. And we see a first example popping up in the countries. And of course, an alignment between the regulatory and the payer HTA level would be very helpful. It's not always so easy to do because in our experience, what payers are looking at is more like disease-specific registries, while EMA very often has just the product in the mind, at least in the starting point. They can only ask for something product specific very often. So that's a bit like the issue on those type of registries, but any coordination on real world evidence would be very helpful because this is needed to close data gaps. So we've seen concrete examples in Germany. Since almost a year, we have legislation in place where GBA can request certain registry data. This is mainly for orphan drugs and conditional marketing authorizations, but we're really gaining ground there. This is happening. There's a lot of discussion about what is the right methodology, how robust is this data? Is it really disease specific? And are we benchmarking the 3 SMA products or the 2 CAR T cells against each other? And even maybe we're benchmarking the 2 CAR T cells against stem cell transplantations like the EBMT registry is doing. So there are examples. One last point on registries. It's not always so easy to set them up from the industry perspective because this, we hear from our members, is very burdensome. You have to do contracting with all the physicians, with all the hospitals. So that cannot be done from one day to the other, but it's a very important vehicle to close data gaps.
Thank you, Alexander. Anna, quickly, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I just want to say that I support the points that Alexander has made, and this was always a criticism from payers and HTA organizations that the product registries of the companies are confidential and intransparent. So we were always saying that we need disease registries, not product registries, and I think EMA is supporting this.
Thank you very much. Olga, any comment on some of the IMI projects that are being developed around real-world evidence? There's quite a lot of work there, and certainly under Horizon Europe, we know that this is part of the key agenda.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of work which is done, indeed, with, IMI, the new framework program, and also, I think a lot of work done also by EMA, also in collaboration, with HTA bodies as well in the past years. So, we need to actually learn from, all this and build a system, that integrates certainly, real world evidence. Registries are already used. There is this difference obviously between the types of registries. So, we need to move into the direction of using real world evidence more. One just, little comment, with the issue would be also, the quality of this data. I think it is an issue that, it needs to be looked at, for the purposes of regulatory and HTA. So yes, with creating the right conditions, and that's why we have also the research projects and all this work done. Thank you, Duan.
Thank you. I mean, what we've been finding at Vital Transformation is some of the HTAs themselves are commissioning the work and we've been doing a lot of work with the Dutch government, which is well known on CAR T, working with many of the hospitals. So increasingly, you're even seeing the HTAs themselves reaching out to do that work. Boy, we could go on for another hour. I'm sure we could, but believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we are almost out of time. So I'm forced to ask the final question, which is really unfortunate, but here we go. From each of you, just quickly, can you tell me what one key deliverable you would like to see concretely committed in the next year to help the EU maintain both competitiveness and patient access related to OMPs, orphan medicines? I'll start with you, Thomas. What's one concrete deliverable you'd like to see related to OMPs?
One thing is I really look forward to all the policy and strategies that the Commission has put forward to, and our ability and opportunity to comment on that, because I think we should not forget that maybe what is it, 1.5 years, there was even a fundamental question where the EU should focus on public health, right? And so we've gone from disappearance of public health to now some really key activities. So I'm really looking forward that something concrete comes out there. The other thing is that concretely, I hope what comes out there from ultimately then Commission proposals really bears in mind the ultimate aim, that is access to patients for new therapies, but that it has a really, let's call it, robust balance between, on the one hand, the topics around access and affordability, which are two words that appear now a lot, also in Commission writings. And what I think we've talked about today as well is how can we promote innovation, in particular in Europe, so to really see a balance between those two approaches, to, as I said, to make sure that patients get the treatments that they need, is something that I really look forward to over the next, what is it going to be, 1.5 years.
Thank you, Thomas. Olga, what concrete deliverable is the EMA shooting for?
Actually, I would agree with Thomas as with the objectives. I think that, we are very much, like the objectives that put for Thomas, we want to see, more innovation, in the field for the benefit of patients. We want to see these products reaching the patients. And for me, a concrete deliverable, which is, actually a task and objective, for the next months, it is to see the defining these policy options, in the orphans field, learning from the evaluation that we have done, and also, building on the pharma strategy with specific objectives and the way forward. So we have the publication of the strategy, later this year. So in my view, this is, one of the most, tangible things that I would like to achieve as a means, not, as the end means of communication, but bringing together, all stakeholders discussing these important issues. Thank you, Duan.
Thank you. Jack, from your perspective, what's one key deliverable Europe should shoot for?
I'm not going to tackle anything as difficult as innovation. I'm going to talk about access. Again, this may be slightly counterintuitive, but I think we should make European orphan drug pricing much more opaque and less transparent. And the reason for that is I think the biggest access threat in Europe over the next 3 to 5 years is going to be political pressure in the US on US versus rest of the world drug prices. And the more transparent our prices are, the harder it will be to maintain them as much lower than the prices in the US.
That's a really good point, Jack. Thank you. Anna, from your perspective, what's one thing you'd look for?
Okay, I'm going to I'm going to take up what Jack said. Okay, I'm not really that keen on opaque prices, but I do get his point. But I do think that a major step forward on European cooperation regarding HTA and maybe also managed entry agreements, that would really help access. I'm not sure if it would help innovation, but if you get a Europe-wide managed entry agreement so that countries, can step out of their boxes and do really something on that issue, that would really be helpful. And of course, you need a Europe-wide HTA for that.
Thank you, Anna. Demetrios, patient perspective, please.
I'm afraid you kept me towards the end because, I don't look for one key deliverable. Sorry for that.
I'm going to hold you to it, sir. Hold you to it.
Yeah. So, because with 7,000 rare diseases and with 90% of them with 1 to 100,000, let's say, patients, then one is not enough. What we need is access. But we are not naive enough to not understand that access, it doesn't have components. The components we need is for this strategy to assess the data, to assess what we need to do about data. We need to assess what we need to do about research and development, what we need to do on the fragmentation of funding, new funding models for research, make sure that the academia and the industry is working close, that we have tangible results that meet the unmet need, and not research in the name of the research and funding for the name of funding. And definitely to find new models of assessing our drugs, new clinical trial models, basket trials, because we cannot solve with the previous, let's say, tools we have the future. So basically what we need is, we need a new, let's say, continuum approach. We need a new paradigm. We need innovation, and we need innovation, most of it in our brain. And this is what will be the one.
Thank you, Demetrius. Just one quick point. Eurordis released a study. 85% of all orphan indications are for less than 1 in 1 million population, which means the maximum population you would have in Europe would be 512 patients for 85% of indications. Alexander, the final word to you, sir.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, Dwayne, for setting this up. I heard a lot of interesting comments, and I would also like to say that I think that the biggest achievable we could have is something we could achieve between payers and industry, and I think we could already achieve it now, which is setting up disease-specific registries for orphan drugs and implement innovative payment models. I share Thomas' optimism that I think things are moving. We see the first examples developing in terms of both managed entry agreements, pay-for-performance models in cell and gene therapies. I mean, not to be forgotten that for the CAR T cells, there have been those agreements implemented also for some other gene therapies, which is in the public domain of therapies like Zynteglo and Zolgensma. This is developing. I think that's a point I wanted to make. And this is what we don't need legislation for necessarily. I think industry and payers can sit together on the table to agree on those type of models, both disease-specific registries, but also innovative payment models. So I would hope that we have that format for discussion. We also need that format for discussion at the EU level. I don't think we need to change legislation for that. I heard a couple of things which are very relevant. I heard that biomarkers, orphan drug designations and biomarkers are very hard to get in the EU, not so much in the US. That's something to be looked at. I heard from Olga that there's a certain clustering going on. It looks like, yes, that's the case, but also competition is good, I would say. And we don't only want to have the first-in-class product and then lose all the others, because we do want to have that competition. But I also take home from your intervention, Olga, that we shouldn't forget about those therapeutic areas where there's nothing out, where we don't see many ODDs. First poll shows that innovation in Europe is critical. We hear from the investor perspective that international reference pricing, but also speedy access, from Jack mentioned that very clearly, is critical. And I think let's work with the transparency directive on making sure that the timelines are met for all the member states, but also let's work with industry, and let's have a discussion in industry how we can have better results on access in all the EU countries. Many other points, but I want to leave it there. We are 2 minutes over. Thanks, Dwayne. That was a great panel. Thanks for setting this up. Back to you.
Thank you. We're out of time, everybody. I'm sorry. Really, we could go on for another hour. Normally, we'd go to Karsmakers and continue the debate over coffee. We can't do that due to COVID-19, unfortunately. Thank you all very much, and thank you for the audience. We had close to 200 people on. We appreciate your questions. With that, have a good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you.